The first snow of the season came down like torn paper in the sodium streetlights, shredding the black above Easton Avenue into slow, fluttering confetti. Ephraim Cade watched it from the scratched windshield of a dented Civic that rattled when idling, the heater breathing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of garlic and cinnamon from a spice jar forever trapped under the seat. He kept one hand on the delivery bags buckled into the passenger seat, as if they were small, slumbering animals, and the other on the wheel, knuckles pale, listening to the city's evening orchestra, sirens in the far distance, tires hissing through slush, the bass thrum of a freight train untangling itself along the river. In the brittle halos of light between street lamps, the snow made everything slow down. Voices, movements, tempers, as if even chaos wore a winter coat here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. He breathed once more, steadying the jitter in his chest that always came near the end of a long Thursday shift, the hour when tips either saved the week or snapped it in half. The clock on the dash said 9:07 p.m. 10 more deliveries if the phone stayed angry. Maybe 6 if the roads bullied the scooters into quitting early and the managers decided to cut drivers one by one. Ephraim rolled his shoulders, felt the ache of 3 jobs stitched into the fibers of those muscles. Pizza nights, warehouse mornings, odd jobs on weekends, each shift a string he strained to keep from tangling around his mother's rent and his sister's tuition. Paramedic schools sat on the horizon like a ship he could see but not board. He turned onto Willow Viaduct, where the city's spine raised him above the river and the old textile mills, their brick faces hoarding histories under frost. The radio spoke weather, while his phone, suction cupped to the dash, fed him addresses and instructions in a calm voice that never got hungry, never shivered. Take the next right. Delivered to room 217, Riverside Lodge. Special note, extra chili flakes. No contact. Leave at door. Copy, he muttered to no one, and felt that small, ridiculous surge, the stupid hope that this time the bag would come back lighter by 1 slice because the kitchen had overfired an order and told him to take it. He'd learned never to plan on it. The universe seemed to notice planning and make a point of disappointing it. Riverside Lodge looked like a secret it had given up keeping. A 2-story motor inn crouched under the viaduct, half the neon letters in its sign burned out so the word Rise bled red into the snow. He parked under a slanted roof that dripped meltwater like a heartbeat. A man in a parka smoked on the second-floor walkway, his breath and smoke braided together, and somewhere a television argued about a game. Ephraim balanced 2 pizzas and a paper bag that rustled with the promise of garlic knots and a tub so heavy with marinara it felt like a responsibility. He took the stairs carefully. Ice had a habit of pretending it was glass here. Room 217. Door scuffed, peephole black, no do not disturb hanger because you needed your own boundaries in a place like this. He knocked 3 times in a rhythm the store manager said sounded professional yet friendly, a rhythm he practiced without knowing he was practicing it. The door opened an inch, a hand reached out, gloved, hesitant, and took the pizzas with the shyness of someone borrowing heat. A voice, thin and embarrassed, said, "Thanks," and slid 2 crumpled 10s back through the gap along with a handful of quarters that tinkled into Ephraim's palm. He wanted to tell the person inside that the tip didn't have to wear shame. He took it anyway and tucked it into his apron, turned away, and breathed out. You didn't try to rescue strangers at motels under the viaduct. You just tried to be kind and quick and not curious. He had 1 step down when he saw him. At the far end of the walkway, under the last flickering light, a man sat on the concrete with his back against the ice-cold railing, elbows on his knees, hands around something wrapped in a grease-stained paper. He was built like the kind of tree the wind forgets to move, thick through the chest and shoulders even hunched, with a jaw that looked hewn by a pocket knife and left unfinished. His denim vest had patches like an essay written in thread and skulls, a heavy leather cut thrown over it despite the cold, and his boots told the long story of a road that didn't care about your soles. A bike helmet hung from one wrist by the chin strap, black and dappled with salt. He wasn't eating, he was smelling the food like a man praying into it, nose close to a cracked styrofoam clamshell he hadn't opened yet, eyes closed. That was the part that caught Ephraim, more than the patches, more than the scar that began at the temple and wrote a pale underline to the man's cheekbone. The patience. Hunger without hands. He knew that posture. He'd seen it in the mirror some nights. Nose near something cheap you'd earned and couldn't eat yet because finishing meant it was over. "Hey," Ephraim said softly, then hated how young his voice sounded inside the winter cathedral of the viaduct, how the concrete made his vowels bigger. His eyes opened, winter lake blue, bloodshot around the edges like a map of endured weather.
"Not looking for trouble," the man said, as if trouble wore a white hat and came with dessert. His voice had gravel in it and an old music, the kind of drawl that suggested he'd been everywhere long enough to keep a souvenir from each place. Ephraim lifted his free hand. "Me neither. Just, here." He lifted the paper bag and said, "Kitchen overcooked a small pepperoni with mushrooms. It'll be cold before it gets dumped, and I don't like throwing anything edible away." Not exactly a lie. Sometimes the kitchen did overcook. Tonight it hadn't. The man's eyes dropped to the bag. He didn't reach for it. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," Ephraim said, heat rising to his face. "It's, his scrambled for dignity found honesty. It's my dinner, but I had a staff slice an hour ago. I can handle a night without another one. Please." The man studied him the way a dog studies a stranger's open hand, hunting for the invisible string that would tug tight when he bit. The wind slithered past them, tasting their cheeks. Down below, a truck groaned past on Willow Viaduct, sending a ripple of vibration through the motel, as if the city were a sleeping animal adjusting its head. "I'm Wrench," the man said, as if that was explanation enough. He reached, took the bag with careful roughness, the way a craftsman takes a new tool. He opened it, and the smell unrolled itself across the walkway. Grease, oregano, warmth, spoken in a dialect the stomach understands without translation. He didn't wolf it. He took one slice and bit, closed his eyes, chewing like a man remembering manners he'd put away for later and unexpectedly needed. "Ephraim," Ephraim said, and only after he'd said it did he realize the man hadn't asked. But Wrench nodded once. "Yep, that matches you," and kept eating. The sauce had painted a red comma at the corner of his mouth. He didn't notice until Ephraim saw it. Then he wiped it away with a thumb and a gesture that, for an instant, made him look like someone's father. "Cold night for two wheels," Ephraim ventured, aware of his shivering toes inside cheap sneakers, the holes where the sock seam pressed the ice of the sole. "Bike's not cold," Wrench said, as if the machine felt what he felt. "She's mad about the salt, though. Growls about it. It's what we all do when they throw grit at us." Another bite, another long, considering chew. "You do this often?" His chin flicked at the bag. The last of the slices vanished like a magic trick performed for nobody. Only when it would go to waste. "I almost said when someone looks like they needed more than me, but something in the man's posture warned him away from pity, like a dog hair that says, 'Don't pet me today.'" Wrench nodded. He folded the greasy paper with reverence, tucked it inside the bag, tied the top as if returning it to the world contained would undo the hunger it had erased. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his cut and produced a creased $5 bill and a run of quarters like a necklace. "Don't," Ephraim said. "Seriously." The man held the money there, suspended in the cold, unblinking. "You'll let me pay," he said. Not threatening, it sounded like a medicine instruction. Take with water, finish the course, don't stop when you feel better. I looked at the five. Rent, groceries, gas, everything weighed it, tried to make it gravity. I closed the man's fingers back around the money with both his hands and felt the heat of those hands, the calluses like history written in braille. Then owe me, I said, and surprised myself with the steadiness of it. Just eat tonight, yeah? Wrench looked at me a long time, like looking was a job you did meticulously or not at all. Then he said, yeah. He tucked the money away, gave a small nod that felt ceremonial, and stood. Standing, he grew. Age fell off him like dust falls off a tarp. He rolled one shoulder, winced. There was history there, too. You're a decent man, Ephraim. Decent's expensive. He turned and took the stairs slow, carrying the empty bag like a veteran carries an old letter. At the base of the stairs, he crossed to a bike that looked like a myth. Long black, chrome where the light could find it, engine a sleeping beast, handlebars like horns. He didn't start it. He sat a minute, head bowed in a posture that was either prayer or inventory, then swung the helmet up and onto his head with the slow accuracy of someone who, when he did things, did them exactly once. Ephraim watched until the machine's heart shuddered and caught, and the sound filled the negative space under the viaduct. It climbed his shins. It rang along his ribs. The bike slid out into the street with that particular grace motorcycles have when their riders make them into sentences. He felt suddenly that he had been spoken to, not just thanked. On the way down the stairs, his phone vibrated. Call from Lampwick's Pizza. He answered with his shoulder and cheek, palms busy with the rail. Cadet. Where at? Dimitri's voice carried the kind of weariness that sounded like anger, but was actually 3 decades of learning to keep a restaurant alive on margins thinner than a nung fingernail.
Riverside, Ephraim said. On my way back, someone wanted to count out quarters. Take money next time, Dimitri grunted. Don't count it with them. It's not a trust exercise, it's pizza. The line clicked dead. The night thickened around the edges after that. Easton Avenue turned his headlights into cones full of glitter, and the Civic baked his knees while freezing his toes. He hit 3 apartment buildings that smelled like laundry or spilled beer or baby powder, depending on which floor you climbed to. A row house where a woman in a robe winked and told him he was a lifesaver, honey. A basement studio where a guy named Jonah tipped him in ones and a handwritten poem he said was actually a rap if you breathed right. On the last return to Lampwick's before 10 p.m., he felt the sift of fatigue in his bones like sugar settling in a jar. Lampwick's lived between a pawn shop and a place that always seemed to be either a laundromat or a church, depending on the week. Inside, warmth like a confession, oven heat turning the windows fog opaque, the air rich with 1,000 dinners stacked into a scent you could lean on. One of the ovens made a sound like an annoyed cat every time the door opened. Flour dust drifted in the fluorescent lights like a different kind of snowfall. Dimitri stood at the make line, his beard white with Parmesan. A faded tattoo in Cyrillic poked out from the sleeve like an old friend who didn't like parties. He pushed 2 pies into boxes with the brisk tenderness of a midwife and glanced up at Ephraim without moving his head. You'll take next route. 2 on Pine, 1 by the mill. Ephraim nodded and didn't mention the minute he'd spent watching a stranger eat. Instead, he tucked the cash and receipts into his apron, drank water from the communal plastic cup, don't think, don't look at the lipstick ring, and shouldered the oven-stale warmth of the bags. The streets had gone quieter, the snow settling into something the city would have to reckon with by morning. He didn't see Wrench again that night. He didn't expect to. The world handed you a moment like that and then changed pockets. He slept hard when he finally stumbled home at 1:11 a.m. to the narrow apartment that smelled like cumin and dish soap, surprised his own bed by falling into it without scrolling, without thinking, only the dim insistence of engines and patches and a pair of Winter Lake eyes fading in loop as he went down. Morning would ask for lifting and stacking at the warehouse. Dawn would be a bruise he prodded and decided not to complain about. He set 3 alarms out of habit and dreamed of the river sliding black under the viaduct like a patient animal. Friday put claws in the city. The temperature dropped 10 degrees and the snow turned feral, crusted on top and slush underneath, the kind of treachery that made even the buses take corners like they were sneaking out of a house that creaked. Ephraim worked the warehouse until his shoulders hummed, showered fast in water that went hot, then cold, then apologized, and made it to Lampwick's with his hair a map of the last hour. The lunch rush had teeth. Office Parks called it in. The mill sent a man in a yellow beanie to pick up 6 large pies for morale. A school ordered 20 personal pizzas and forgot to open the door when he arrived. By dusk, fatigue had moved in behind his eyes and hung pictures on the walls. He still found a grin for the kid who handed him $1 and a trading card. It's a holographic, you can see if you tilt it. And for the older woman who told him she'd liked his name because it sounded like a word a prophet would say. He took whatever the day gave him and tried to say thank you back. He was cleaning a line of slush from the Civic's floor mats with the side of his shoe when his phone buzzed with a number stamped unknown caller. He considered letting it die in the snow. He answered. "Is this Lampwick's?" The voice had a curious roughness to it, like it had been sanded to keep secrets from catching. He could hear engines faint in the background, but not cars. The vowels carried an older music. The sound pulled the muscles behind Ephraim's ears tight. "Delivery," Ephraim said. "This is Ephraim." A pause, a breath that sounded like a decision. "I was told you help a man last night under the bridge." Ephraim felt his heartbeat tilt. There were 1,000 reasons someone might call about a kindness, and not all of them wore smiles. He leaned his hip against the Civic as if it might know what to do if the conversation turned sideways. "I gave someone my dinner, yeah?" He kept his voice casual. He made sure his eyes were on the snow, not the door, not the street. Another breath. "You're free to handle a large drop." The caller didn't ask if Lampwick's was free, he asked if Ephraim was. "We got a church at 9. Want pies there by 8:30. Cash on the barrel. You tell your man at the store we pay up front so no one gets their wires crossed." Church. He'd heard the word in other contexts, in the vocabulary of patches, of machines with 2 wheels and long shadows. Church meant a meeting. He pictured 20 guys in leather around a table with beer rings and secrets. He pictured the news from a decade ago that made his mother lock the car doors when she drove past a convoy. He thought, this is a prank. This is someone seeing if I'll dance when they whistle. "How many?" Ephraim asked, because the part of his brain that managed the math of heat and timing and traffic had taken over, while the rest of him stared wide-eyed from behind the glass. 250. The number struck like a thrown wrench. 250 pizzas was not pizza. It was weather. It was logistics. It was an oven battalion. I almost laughed. That's a lot of dough. "We ain't subtle," the voice said, and he could hear a smile in it that had nothing to do with jokes and everything to do with a certain kind of pride. "We'll send 2 prospects with cash to your shop in an hour. If your man says yes, we'll give him the list. Half cheese, half pepperoni, and tell him we don't put pineapple on anything that breathes." The laughter in the background was more like thunder starting far away. "You Ephraim?" "Yeah." The word felt like he had signed something. "Who's calling?"
Applause moved through the hangar like a low tide. The general did not clap. He watched. The colonel clapped once, and it echoed in the dome of the listening room like a knuckle tapping a door. After, when the kids were splayed like commas on the concrete, and Darla had finally let the generator idle with something like pride, the general asked Lillet to walk. They went to the parade ground where the blue of evening made silhouettes of them. "You spoke to my engineers the way I wish my best captains speak," he said without ceremony. "Clear verbs, no performance. You told truth like it was a tool and not a flavor." "It's the only thing that lifts," she said. He looked toward the bunker. "When you opened that room, I assumed I would spend the rest of the day telling you what you couldn't do. Then I watched it listen to a county find its spine. I have seen many rooms full of expensive hearing that never listened to anything that mattered. I don't say this." He stopped, as if the words might misbehave if they heard themselves coming. "I don't say this often. I was wrong." He took a breath that sounded like it had been scheduled years ago and missed several appointments. "We came to assess, to decide whether to take back what the Army mislaid. My brief to my superiors will contain a recommendation I have not delivered in a decade." "What kind?" she asked softly. "That this site be designated a cooperative civilian training and response facility," he said. "That its unique instrumentation be retained in place under shared stewardship. That its power plant be upgraded, its perimeter repaired, and its purpose written down in the kinds of letters that change budgets." Lillet stood very still. She had expected a fight that would take years and end in a compromise that tasted like cardboard. "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear it out loud to believe that sound exists. He looked at her the way a map looks at a compass. "Because this is the first time in a long time I have stood inside a room built for war and watched it pour out something else. Because my engineers cried in a listening chamber and lied about pollen. Because your kids told my majors to move a barricade, and my majors did, and no one died, and you kept the insulin cold. Because the ground sang, and you treated it like a choir instead of a target. Because I am tired of making speeches at ribbon cuttings for shooting ranges." He smiled then, real and difficult. "Because I want to stand in front of my peers and make them speechless." She laughed, and the laugh had tears in it. "We'll need money. We'll need to replace those insulators. We'll need a water truck that believes in us. You'll have signatures, and then money follows like a mule follows a carrot." "Carrots need water," she said. "Then we'll find you a mule that drinks from a listening room," he said, and shook her hand the way men shake hands when they are trying very hard not to hug a stranger who feels like a teammate. They signed the forms in the admin office 2 weeks later, under the chalkboard with the question she'd written, "What if the ground could talk back?" The designation letter was heavy paper, with a seal that refused to pick a lane between ugly and impressive. The colonel cried openly and wiped his eyes with a shop towel that had seen both grease and gratitude. The county commissioner, who wasn't bright, showed up with a pie that had cracked in the middle on the drive, but tasted like relief. The upgrades began in a hum. A new inverter that purred like a cat that had taken an oath, replacement insulators that shone like newly bleached bone, a perimeter fence that said, "We welcome you" by having a gate, and also, "We mean it when we say no." They installed a weather station on the roof of the powerhouse that told wind speed like gossip and recorded rainfall like a scientist who had once been a poet. Martha taught a class every Saturday called Things That Look Harmless and Aren't. She began each session by telling the story of the tripwire and the boy who learned to breathe while he held a flashlight. Darla ran a microgrid workshop that made the words phase imbalance become a punchline. Boone started a map on the wall where people could stick pins in places where the base had helped. The pins multiplied until the map looked like a sky. On a Tuesday morning that smelled like new paint and sage, the Army returned, not with clipboards or clauses, but with a camera and 3 generals who had argued in a room somewhere and decided they liked the idea of being stunned on purpose. They wore dress uniforms that made them look like history books. They walked the powerhouse and nodded at gauges with their mouth, but not their eyes. They stood in the hangar and let a drone lift a bag of saline and landed on a deck the size of a pie plate and clapped like men who had forgotten their hands could do that. They ate pie in the admin office and left their forks in the sink because old habits are democracy. Then they entered the listening room. The dome amplified their footsteps until each step sounded like a debt being paid. Lele waited at the console with Asha and Mendoza and the colonel. The general who had walked with her on the parade ground stood back, a small smile tucked in the corner of his mouth as if he were remembering a private joke in which he was both the butt and the audience. "Show us," the tallest general said, and it wasn't a challenge, it was a plea. Asha brought up the array. The trace wrote itself across the screen like a musical staff. Mendoza tuned the gain, and with two small motions of his wrist, brought the valley into focus. The dome breathed. Lele spoke because the room needed a voice to transcribe the wonder. "This is the South Ridge. Today the ground is quiet, but you can hear the new channel we cut yesterday. See this faint line? That's water speaking in a smaller voice. This is the railbed. We marked the soft spots. And here," she pointed at a series of gentle undulations, regular as a sleeping animal's breath. "That's the aquifer. You can tell it's healthy because it sighs instead of wheezes." "And that?" one of the generals asked, pointing to a set of fast, bright spikes marching across the trace like skinny soldiers. "Kids on scooters," Mendoza said, deadpan. "We make them promise to keep to the hangar when we're calibrating. They keep half the promise." The generals laughed, and the laugh turned the room into a place where something new could happen. "Here's today's reason," Lele said softly. "We've tied the listening to alerts that don't require a genius to interpret, color bands and plain language. If the ground sings in the key of trouble, the base lights shift, the bell rings, and the clinic gets a text that says, 'Move your fridge.' If the state highway learns a new habit we don't like, the county sees it before a motorist volunteers to learn it with their car." She stepped back and let them come closer to the screen. Soldiers and engineers, men with medals and men with memories. The dome took their inhalations and gave them back like waves.
Ephraim wanted to say decent is expensive, like Wrench had the night before, but the word stuck. He thought instead of his mother's rent envelope, the corner frayed from too much hope. And the way the emergency fund in his head was just a phrase he said out loud to make other people comfortable. He thought of paramedic school and how his hands already knew the shape of a steering wheel at 3 in the morning. Rook picked up the helmet when it began to look like gravity had opinions. He set it in front of Ephraim, and the weight of it made the folding table shiver. "Count later," Rook said, not unkindly. "Take it now." He slid an envelope across the table too. Plain. Fat. "That's the tip." Ephraim started, dumb and stunned. "For the order," Rook said. His eyes did not move from Ephraim's face. "Your boss got paid. This is for you." His voice didn't leave room for that weak little dance good men sometimes do when they're offered something generous, and they try to say no so they'll look humble. He had no patience for theater. Ephraim's fingers made a decision before his mind finished arguing. He took the envelope. The paper was thick enough to remember what you did to it. He slid his thumb under the flap where someone had sealed it sloppily in the cold. He lifted. The first bill was not a 20. It wasn't 100 either. It was a note in clean block letters on a white index card sitting on top of the stack like a lid. "For the man who shared his meal, 5,000. Thank you for making a long night shorter." For a second, the sound under the bridge dropped, not because the engines went quiet, but because all the sound took 2 steps back to let the moment walk through. Ephraim saw his mother's eyes when he'd tell her.
He saw his sister laughing and bumping him with her shoulder. He saw the Civic with 4 tires that didn't sound like a song about danger. He saw 100 small panics lining up and being told to sit down. He lifted the card, felt the thickness underneath that made the number feel like an understatement rather than a boast. His throat worked. His heart numbered the beats like an accountant. He looked up to say something like, "I can't," and something like, "I shouldn't," and something like, "Why me?" And all those words were small and untrained animals. Rook cut off whatever he was going to say with a hand that asked for quiet without command. The lot's edges darkened, a shift in weather you feel before you see. Somewhere near the entrance to the lot, 2 headlights swung slow and stopped as if the car were thinking hard. A siren far off toyed with the idea of getting closer. Wrench's head turned, the muscle in his jaw doing a small, undecidable thing. Rook's eyes sharpened the way a knife sharpens a kitchen. Everything suddenly knew its job. "Hold on to that," Rook said softly, not looking at the envelope now, looking beyond Ephraim to the shape resolving itself under the viaduct's open throat. "Whatever happens next, you don't let go. You hear me?" Ephraim's hand tightened around the envelope without permission from anything but instinct. The engines near the mouth of the lot were still. The people were not. Someone shifted a table 2 inches as if those 2 inches would be history later. Wrench stepped half in front of him in the uncomplicated geometry of protection learned and practiced. The headlights blinked once. The siren, far off now, fell quiet like an argument that decided to continue in the kitchen. The car's door opened. A boot hit slush with the sound of a decision landing. A figure stepped into the light and pushed the hood back, and Ephraim saw a woman in a black parka with the hood fur turned into a halo by the sodium light, snow stippling her eyelashes, a badge glinting at her chest like an argument she was willing to have. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. She was smaller than the night made her seem, compact strength under the coat, hair tucked in a loose braid that had been a ponytail earlier and had given up. She lifted her hand, palm open in a gesture that looked like both peace and policy. "Evening," she said, voice steady in the way of people who say steady things for a living. "Lieutenant Ortega, City PD. Noise complaint? Traffic complaint? Everyone breathing?" Ephraim's fingers flexed around the envelope without him asking them to. He felt Wrench shift, half a step closer, carrying heat like a small contained fire. Rook didn't move at all. His stillness was the kind that absorbed motion from everyone else and made it look like his idea. Around them, the lot adjusted in those quiet ways groups adjust. Conversations lowering but not stopping, bodies angling to give space while pretending they hadn't. "Lieutenant," Rook said, polite enough to be a bridge and iron enough to be a gate. "We're just eating." "I can smell it," Ortega said, and the corner of her mouth made a shape that almost became a smile before she disciplined it back to duty. "Pepperoni and a city's worth of exhaust. I'm not here to be a problem. I am here because your engines made a choir and my dispatchers love music less than rules." "We want a slice?" Wrench asked, and this time the smile escaped her control long enough to leave evidence that it had been there. "After," she said. "We keep it safe, and I'll take you up on it." She glanced past them at the mouth of the lot where the car idled with lights low like a cat's half-lidded eyes. "I need you to keep the entrance clear, no burnouts, no fool's work. And if I say go, you go. You know me. I don't play at warnings." Rook dipped his chin. "We know you, Lieutenant." He tipped his head at 2 prospects who moved wordlessly to adjust tables and bodies, something like choreography without music. The entrance breathed a little wider. The engines shifted their weight on their tires as if they'd heard and were willing to negotiate. Ortega's gaze found Ephraim then like a flashlight that had finally located the source of a glint. Her eyes slid to the envelope, back to his face, and she lifted an eyebrow a hair. He felt stupidly like a kid caught holding something not meant for him, and then realized she wasn't judging the money, she was measuring the tremor in his knuckles and the care in his grip. "First time in a current this strong?" she asked, softer now, like they were standing 6 inches left of the world. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The ma'am made him sound younger than he wanted, but it felt right.
You're with them? She flicked her chin at Rook and Wrench and the 100 engines that had turned a cold lot warm. I brought the pizza, he said, and Ortega's mouth did that almost smile again. They brought everything else. Keep your head, and keep that close. She had not finished the sentence when the evening decided to test agreements. A sedan at the lot's mouth tried to turn in too fast on ice that wanted other plans. Its front wheel kissed the curb, skated sideways, and the back end fishtailed into a low slide that would have been a laugh if not for the rider easing in behind it on a silver bike whose tires were already negotiating with physics. The rider's front brake locked for a blink. The bike stuttered left. The car's bumper tapped the back wheel. For a second that had 100 consequences, everything hung. Then the rider went down. It was not a cinematic crash. It was the minor catastrophe of weight and metal and the wrong angle. The bike slid under him like a rug yanked by a polite ghost. His shoulder hit first, then his hip. Then his helmet kissed the concrete with a sound that Ephraim would hear later when he tried to fall asleep. The car stopped the way guilt stops. A sudden, breathless halt. The rider didn't get up. Wrench moved before Ephraim knew he had decided to. Rook said, "Hold," and the world obeyed, the gathered river pulling back into its banks. Ortega lifted the radio at her shoulder and said something short that had the shape of numbers. And Ephraim's body found the task it had been wanting all along. He was at the rider's side in 5 long steps that somehow did not slip. He dropped to his knees. He didn't think about the envelope. It stayed in his left hand under his jacket, tucked between ribs and arm, held there by a bicep that was suddenly a clamp. His right hand found the chin of the helmet and steadied it. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Stay with me. I'm here." The rider groaned, a sound several languages share. His visor was fogged from inside with breath that sounded like it had forgotten rhythm and was taking it up again shyly. A decal on the side of the helmet showed a cartoon raven carrying a wrench in its beak. The patch on his jacket said Barnes, and under that a smaller one said Prospect. "Neck pain?" he asked, the questions running along tracks that he'd laid in his head on nights when hope looked like textbooks. "Can you feel your fingers?" He touched 2 on the rider's left hand where it lay open on the ice like a question. The fingers twitched, then curled. "Good." "Hurts," Barnes said, not moving. His voice was young the way night is young at 9 o'clock before it decides what kind of trouble it wants to be. "I know," Ephraim said. "Don't try to get up. Don't nod. Just blink if you hear me." He took a breath, measured, steady. "Blink." Barnes blinked. "Good. You're doing great." He lifted 1 pizza box off the nearby stack on instinct and slid it under the rider's shoulder as a wedge to keep him from rolling, its cardboard weight familiar and suddenly holy. He snapped open his own coat with his elbow, used a scarf to cradle the rider's forearm, used the strap of his delivery bag to improvise a soft restraint that would keep the arm from flopping if a tremor came. He talked while he did it, the way my favorite EMT on YouTube taught. Keep the brain busy so it forgets to panic. "You from around here, Barnes?" A blink. "You got kids?" A pause, then no blink. "Girlfriend who tells you not to do dumb stuff?" Ephraim asked, hearing himself sound like someone older and feeling, absurdly, the rush of joy that he could be such a person for a minute. A blank, then a slow second blank that might have been a laugh if laughs wore seatbelts. Ortega landed on her knees opposite him like they'd planned it. "EMS 3 minutes out," she said, her breath showing itself in the cold like she was proof of life. "You're good?" "Stable," Ephraim said, and he felt the word click into place like a puzzle piece. "Helmet stays on." "Correct," Ortega murmured like a teacher hiding her pride so the kid could keep owning the answer. She glanced at his hands on the helmet, at the scarf, the pizza box. "You training for something?" "Trying," he said, and thought of tuition like a mountain, and of the envelope pressed under his arm like a rope thrown down from the summit. The driver of the sedan had gotten out, hands up, in the universal sign language of I'm sorry, I made of mistakes." Rook pointed 2 men to him, with a quiet nod. They shepherded the driver to the side, out of photos, out of the way. The bikes nearby formed a gentle barrier without becoming a wall. The lot turned its body so the scene had room to breathe. "Open it,"
he said, because sharing was the only way to make that wait honest. She did. She read the card. She blinked 4 times, and then she did a thing she had done when he was 6 and brought home a picture of a house with bad perspective. She put her hand at the back of his head and brought his forehead to her lips. It was the quietest thank you and the loudest blessing. "We fixed the car," she said, practical first, so tears could maybe stay in the room without being the boss of it. "We pay the rent for 2 months. We put some for Alia's books, even though she'll insist she can get them cheaper. And you," she held up the card from Keisha like a new law, "you call this woman and ask to ride along." "I have to work," he said, automatically, but the word have to sounded weak next to the weight of can. "You will still work," she said, "but God does not send the door and expect you to compliment the wood." Alia cackled into her cereal. "She's been saving that one," she said. "Use it in your vows when you marry a paramedic." He called. Dispatch put him on hold for 11 minutes that felt like penance and expectation braided together. Keisha came on with a voice that fit a mourning. "You the pizza poet?" she asked. "I'm Ephraim," he said. "You said—" "I said ride along," she cut in, gently, because she liked saving people from their own humility. "Tonight, 6 to midnight. You bring coffee that doesn't taste like hot cardboard, and I'll let you take blood pressure and write the names right on the chart." He said yes with a heart that had already arrived. Work bent around the ride along like the city bends around the river, complaining but making room. Dmitri, when told, looked over his glasses and said, "You bring me the stories after, not the blood, the stories." He slapped 2 pizza vouchers on the counter as if he were paying a toll. "For your medics, it helps to have friends with sirens." 6 p.m. found him at the bay doors of Station 14 with 2 coffees and a pizza box balanced on his knee like an offering. Keisha waved him in with the kind of wave you use for puppies and rookies. Louis nodded without looking up from the kit he was inventorying. They rolled on a fall at a retirement home, more dignity than pain, a panic attack in a diner, more loneliness than medical, a guy who thought he was dying but was actually allergic to his new detergent. Between calls, Keisha quizzed him, and he answered, and sometimes his answers were right, and sometimes they were wrong in interesting ways. At 9, they got a call everyone respects. Vehicle versus pedestrian near the mill. Snow clotted in the mill's throat, and the road there had black ice like a habit. They rolled without lights because the street needed to hear them coming without slipping into its own fear. The pedestrian had been unlucky, not reckless, stepping off the curb at the wrong moment into a car that had done the same math and come up with a different answer. He was on his side, eyes wide in the way eyes get when the world has suddenly changed to a language you don't speak. Keisha went to his head. Louis went to the bleeding, which was not terrible but also not negotiable. Ephraim went to his feet, to see where they had tried to go and had not gotten, because sometimes feet tell stories when mouths cannot. "Hey," Keisha said to the man, voice slipping into the gear that had soothed hundreds. "You with me?" The man blinked and said, "I can't afford this," which is the diagnosis of a country and not a body. "I know," Keisha said. "We'll talk about bills later. For now, breathe with me." She made the man's lungs a metronome. Louis made the bleeding a smaller story. Ephraim held a leg, stabilized a knee, and felt like his hands had found the thing they were made to do. When it was done, and the man was in the back, and Louis was scribbling the kind of handwriting only other medics can read, Keisha leaned against the bumper for 30 seconds and let the cold slap her honest. She looked at Ephraim and said, "You're going to be good at this. Not because of your hands, because you hear what people mean when they say the wrong thing." He let that sit where compliments should sit, somewhere between the skin and the bone, where you can feel them later when you need them. He went home that night with a head full of sirens and a heart that didn't know whether to race or rest. He slept and dreamed not of engines, but of breath, of counting, of keeping strangers inside their bodies long. "Open it," he said, because because sharing was the only way to make that weight honest. She did. She read the card. She blinked 4 times, and then she did a thing she had done when he was 6 and brought home a picture of a house with bad perspective. She put her hand at the back of his head and brought his forehead to her lips. It was the quietest thank you and the loudest blessing. "We fixed the car," she said, practical first, so tears could maybe stay in the room without being the boss of it. "We pay the rent for 2 months. We put some for Alia's books, even though she'll insist she can get them cheaper. And you," she held up the card from Keisha like a new law, "you call this woman and ask to ride along." "I have to work," he said, automatically, but the word have to sounded weak next to the weight of can. "You will still work," she said, "but God does not send a door and expect you to compliment the wood." Alia cackled into her cereal. "She's been saving that one," she said. "Use it in your vows when you marry a paramedic." He called. Dispatch put him on hold for 11 minutes that felt like penance and expectation braided together. Keisha came on with a voice that fit a mourning. "You the pizza poet?" she asked. "I'm Ephraim," he said. "You said—" "I said ride along," she cut in, gently, because she liked saving people from their own humility. "Tonight, 6 to midnight. You bring coffee that doesn't taste like hot cardboard, and I'll let you take blood pressure and write the names right on the chart." He said yes with a heart that had already arrived. Work bent around the ride along like the city bends around the river, complaining but making room. Dmitri, when told, looked over his glasses and said, "You bring me the stories after, not the blood, the stories." He slapped 2 pizza vouchers on the counter as if he were paying a toll. "For your medics, it helps to have friends with sirens." 6 p.m. found him at the bay doors of Station 14 with 2 coffees and a pizza box balanced on his knee like an offering. Keisha waved him in with the kind of wave you use for puppies and rookies. Louis nodded without looking up from the kit he was inventorying. They rolled on a fall at a retirement home, more dignity than pain, a panic attack in a diner, more loneliness than medical, a guy who thought he was dying but was actually allergic to his new detergent. Between calls, Keisha quizzed him, and he answered, and sometimes his answers were right, and sometimes they were wrong in interesting ways. At 9, they got a call everyone respects. Vehicle versus pedestrian near the mill. Snow clotted in the mill's throat, and the road there had black ice like a habit. They rolled without lights because the street needed to hear them coming without slipping into its own fear. The pedestrian had been unlucky, not reckless, stepping off the curb at the wrong moment into a car that had done the same math and come up with a different answer. He was on his side, eyes wide in the way eyes get when the world has suddenly changed to a language you don't speak. Keisha went to his head. Louis went to the bleeding, which was not terrible but also not negotiable. Ephraim went to his feet, to see where they had tried to go and had not gotten, because sometimes feet tell stories when mouths cannot. "Hey," Keisha said to the man, voice slipping into the gear that had soothed hundreds. "You with me?" The man blinked and said, "I can't afford this," which is the diagnosis of a country and not a body. "I know," Keisha said. "We'll talk about bills later. For now, breathe with me." She made the man's lungs a metronome. Louis made the bleeding a smaller story. Ephraim held a leg, stabilized a knee, and felt like his hands had found the thing they were made to do. When it was done, and the man was in the back, and Louis was scribbling the kind of handwriting only other medics can read, Keisha leaned against the bumper for 30 seconds and let the cold slap her honest. She looked at Ephraim and said, "You're going to be good at this. Not because of your hands, because you hear what people mean when they say the wrong thing." He let that sit where compliments should sit, somewhere between the skin and the bone, where you can feel them later when you need them. He went home that night with a head full of sirens and a heart that didn't know whether to race or rest. He slept and dreamed not of engines, but of breath, of counting, of keeping strangers inside their bodies long